Okay, let's get started. Good morning. Welcome to DevCon 2018. Thank you so much for choosing this as your first session in DevCon 2018. And this is FileMaker Relationships from the beginning. We are not assuming anything about what you already know about FileMaker Relationships, but if you already do know something about how they work, hopefully this session will have some things that fill in the gaps as to your understanding of how things really work in FileMaker. Let's start with just a little story about my relational journey in FileMaker, and it started back last century in 1996. That was the year that FileMaker released FileMaker Pro 3, and it went relational. And at the time, in 1996, I didn't know what going relational meant. So I was based in Darwin in Australia at the time, and I hopped on a plane, 4-hour plane journey down to Melbourne, and on that journey I read the FileMaker Pro 3 manual from cover to cover. I was going there for a course offered by Claris at the time. They flew a couple of people out from here in the States to run this course in relational design. So I read the manual on the way down, got off the plane, and I only had one question left. It's not that rude. So I still didn't get why you needed a relational database. Up until that point, I'd been using FileMaker as a database and doing lookups quite neatly, where I could take information from one table and put it into another table just by looking it up, copying across. And if I needed it to be refreshed, I simply did a relookup. So why did I need relationships? So I turned up to this 3-day course with my trusty microcomputer, which was more like a brick with a colour screen. And I duly got handed the book for the course, which I still have, with my name in the front and some sort of inscription about wanting to know what this was all about. So the way that FileMaker presented relational design was that the new FileMaker 3 software had these new relational capabilities. Best-selling end-user database, legendary ease of use, all the sort of things that FileMaker marketing did back then. And it also listed the hardware and software requirements for this course, and to use the software, fairly hefty sort of requirements. Yep, that's 8 megabytes of RAM, not 8 gigabytes of RAM, 8 megabytes of RAM required to run this intense software. So we did the course 3 days, and sometime during that 3 days, this happened. And suddenly I went, yes, where have you been all my life? I could get a dialog box up like this in FileMaker Pro 3, and I could create a relationship between two files, effectively two tables, and on my layout, I could create this newfangled thing called a portal that I could display related records in and even edit them and do everything in real time. It was amazing. I went away from that with a newfound sort of love of databases, and that was the end of me for database design. I was going to do this stuff for the rest of my life. So my name's David Head. I'm based out of Sydney, Australia, and that explains my slight accent that you may have detected. My company is ULearn IT, and we do FileMaker development and FileMaker training and mentoring. I'm a FileMaker certified developer, of course, and I'm a FileMaker Business Alliance trainer. Okay, so this session is FileMaker Relationships from the beginning. As I said, we don't assume that you know anything about FileMaker Relationships or FileMaker itself, but if you do, then that's a good starting point, and we can sort of correct maybe some misconceptions along the way and fill in some of the gaps in your self-learning. So we're going to start off with concepts, move on to key fields and the data they contain, one-to-many relationships, and how we drive those relationships in FileMaker. Honestly, in an hour, I was talking about this to people at the speakers' dinner the other night, and they said, how are you going to get from here to there in an hour? said, yeah, well, normally when we do a course, we're taking half a day to sort of get these concepts set and give you all sorts of examples and exercises to do, but we've got another 40 odd minutes to do this. So let's start straight off with concepts. And I suppose we would assume at this point that you understand what tables and fields are in the database. So we've got tables and we've got fields. The fields was actually from the other night. We arrived here on Saturday and we went to the baseball. Can anyone identify what that field is? Anyone? The Texas Rangers Stadium? You get a book. You can collect that later. So that's the Texas Rangers Stadium. We were happy to see Texas actually win that game 3-1. No, really, tables in terms of databases are a representation of things in the real world. So a table, in this case, we've got a table of people, we have a table of sales. And when we look inside that table, we see fields. FileMaker refers to them as fields. Other database platforms sometimes refer to them as columns because they are columns in a table. And these are the attributes of those things. So we've got attributes like name and age and total and status. And there's data in there of different types like text and number and date. And then when you look inside one of those tables that represents things, you have records, and each record is an instance of a thing. And you fill in the data about that particular instance in the record. So that's the basic structure of any database, whether it's FileMaker or anything else. When we then talk about relationships, we're talking about links between those things. A link between a person and a sale, or between a person and some other thing. And this means, the relationship means that we can use data across those tables from a different context. So if we're looking at a customer record, we can look through the relationship and we can see all of the invoices that they haven't paid for yet, that are still pending. If we look at it from the context of an invoice, we can look back into the customer and we can see what their name is and what their address is to put that onto the invoice. So this is the idea of relationships. So the big question is, well, why bother? Why even bother trying to fix this? What problem are we trying to fix here? Why not just use a flat file? Why not just put everything into one table? We have a column for everything and everything in its place. Often there's more than one piece of data in one of those columns when people start doing this because they're economising on the amount of columns they're going to use. So why not do that? Well, here's an example of a contact record for a fictitious person who works at FileMaker. All of the information that we record about that person has been put into a single record here, but there are already problems with that. We can look at these fields and see that there is multiple pieces of data in each of those fields. So their full name has gone into one field. I often say to people in courses that if you ever set up a database with someone's full name in one field, I will find you and I will counsel you out of that. Never do that. Obviously, they've also put all the information about the address into one field. They've put all the information about the company address into one field. There's aggregation of data here, which will cause problems for sorting, for searching, for reporting. Another problem here is that they've put all the information about the company that Matthew works for into Matthew's record. So that means that the next person that we put into our database that works for FileMaker, we need to repeat all that information in their record as well. So we get a degree of data redundancy there and problems with updating that data. Down the bottom here, when they're recording notes, and this is a typical way that people might start off recording notes, they want to impose some sort of structure to a note to say, well, a note has to have a timestamp, it has to have a type of note, email in, email out, etc., and of course the note. And I want you to do it in this way, and I also want you to make room at the top of the field so that the most recent note is at the top. Now that works fine for a little while, and then someone mucks it up, someone deletes all the notes in someone's record and can't seem to get them back again, and the structure isn't quite right. So you can't really enforce structure in there, and of course if you try and dive into that and work out whether there are outstanding calls, then you can't really report on that. So when you look at this structure, you really see three separate entities in one. You've got the person, you've got the company, and you've got their notes. And those entities are linked or related in some way. A company has people attached to it, and a note has a person attached to it. So this is the better structure that we need to do rather than setting everything up in a single table. Here's another quick example, and this is the information about this session all put into one record, one flat file. And when we look at these in table format, we can see all the different sessions that are running at this time in DevCon and see all the information about those. But when we study that information, we see that there are in fact 5 different entities represented here. The session, the track, the speaker, the room, and even the time slot can be considered to be different entities. And when we pull all that stuff apart, everything centres around the session, and it has sort of child records flowing off that session in terms of how you would structure that in a real relational structure to get the best out of the database. So when you look at the structure behind something like DevCon to Go, this is the structure. Even though when you look at this session in DevCon to Go, you're seeing all this information at the same time, it's because it's being pulled in from a lot of tables. So one of the reasons why we bother is to eliminate data redundancy. We don't want the case where we need to repeat someone's company information all over again just because they work for the same company as someone else. Also, we don't want necessarily to have to write Texas 123 every time if you're putting the room in there, or beginner every time, because you're always going to be making sure that you type it the same way, spell it the same way, etc. So you want to be able to put data in one place and leverage that data. The second reason why you bother is to improve efficiency with data updates. So it means that if, for example, FileMaker changes their phone number, we can change that in one place and it propagates to everyone who works for that company, rather than finding everyone who works for that company and changing their phone number. Also, to ensure data consistency and integrity, so in the case of the notes, we can make sure that people do actually enter those different pieces of information and enter them where they need to consistently. And also to make sure that people are also always using the same data, because they're just leveraging off it and say, yep, they work for FileMaker, obviously that's the address, that's the phone number. It also leads to more flexible reporting, being able to go into our contact database and say, give me a list of all of the email in events over the last 6 months for any person, is elementary to do with a properly structured relational database, impossible to do if all that data is just munged into one notes field. And there may be some performance and improvement of your system if you get it structured correctly. So there are certain types of relationships. There are 3 types of relationships, the combinations of these. There's one-to-many relationships, or many-to-one, depending on which way you look at it. So a company can have many people and a person can be linked to a single company. A person can have many notes, a note links back to a single person. A simple one-to-many relationship. There are many-to-many relationships, so things like a speaker can speak on many tracks, and a track obviously has many speakers. And also a track may appear in many rooms, so the beginner sessions at DevCon won't only be in this room, they'll be in different rooms, but also this room won't only be beginner sessions, there'll be other levels of sessions in this room. And of course the last combination is a one-to-one, and there are reasons why you might set this up in your database where a speaker has a bio record attached to them. So all the stuff about their photograph, their biography, all their history, their certifications and things you can put into a separate record. And in that case, each speaker has one bio record and each bio record relates to one speaker. Same sort of thing could be done with this room to say that the room itself, we could separate off the specifications of the room, like the length, the width, the height, the capacity of the room, the seating capacity of the room, the sort of facilities of the room. We can put those into a separate related record. So in this session, as I said, we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to focus on the simple one and the most common one of one-to-many, and then you might be able to ask me questions later about the others. So let's move on to key fields and key data. There are a couple of keys that you need to know about, and the first of those is a primary key. And I've separated here the idea of the primary key field and the data it contains. So a primary key field is something that should appear in every table that you create. So you should have a primary key field in every table. In a lot of ways, it should be the very first field that you create. It should auto-enter its contents when a new record gets created. And it should be validated such that its contents is never empty and always unique to records in that table. When we look at the data in that field, obviously it is unique to one record in that table. It always exists. It never ever changes. It gets established and that's it. It's just stamped in there forever. And the last important point is that it is meaningless. You're not going to use this data for anything outside the database, and to that extent, as a user, you probably will never see a primary key and a foreign key in real life because it's meaningless. It's only used by the database in the relationship. So the second type of key that we talk about is a foreign key, and we'll look at where these fit into the database in a moment. So as far as the field goes, the field usually contains a value. There are some cases where it's reasonable for the foreign key to be empty. The field is not in every table, and there could be multiple foreign key fields in a particular table. It's reasonable for a table to have more than one foreign key, whereas there is only ever one primary key in a table. From the data point of view in the foreign key contains primary key data from another record. And it may be duplicated, so there may be multiple records with the same data in it, and that's because those records belong to the same record over there. It usually exists, as I say, there are some cases where it's reasonable for the foreign key to be empty, and it almost never changes. There are some edge cases where you might change the foreign key if something had been linked to the wrong parent record. But in most cases, what you'll do is just delete that record and do it properly. So let's look at an analogy for a one-to-many relationship and these primary and foreign keys appropriate to our current location. We look at cattle ranches and the cattle that they contain. We've got to find some way of uniquely identifying a cattle ranch, and of course, what cattle ranchers use is a brand. So consider the brand to be the primary key of the ranch. Brands actually have to be registered and they have to be unique. So there is a registry in the United States of all of the cattle ranch brands, and you can't register a brand that someone is already using. So they all have to be unique. So they've got that enforced uniqueness of being a primary key. The interesting one there, in the middle of the top, there's the Circle Bar Ranch. Makes sense from the thing. The one on the top right is the Rocker Bee Ranch. That rocker underneath and the bee sitting in it. That's a fairly standard symbol for brands. Anyway, so when you have cattle and you need to attach them to your brand, you've got to put your primary key onto the cattle. So how do we do that? We do that. We stamp them on. This picture is of an electronic branding rather than actually putting it into the fire and branding them these days. They've got an electronic brand that stamps that brand onto the cow. So this, on this end, is the foreign key. So the foreign key on the cow is the brand, the primary key data from that particular ranch. Now, of course, I said to you that every table should have a primary key. So what's the primary key on the cow? What's the thing that uniquely identifies one of those beasts? An ear tag. So that's got nothing to do necessarily with the ranch itself. That's something unique about that cow that you can then use in other situations. So here's another example, a simple example of a person and a note. So we look at this from a data point of view and say that each of those tables will have a primary key that uniquely identifies records in those tables. There'll be a foreign key on the note end of the relationship, which will contain the number of the person that that note relates to. And if we look at three people here, 1045, 6 and 7, and we look at 4 notes, we can look at those notes and we can quickly identify who belongs to those notes. So these notes are obviously attached to that person because they contain the data from that person's primary key. So notice that this has nothing to do with the primary key of the note. It's to do with a link between the primary key of the person and the foreign key of the person in the note. When we look at this person, we can identify a note that belongs to them. And finally, if we look at that note, we can identify the person that it belongs to. So that's how the relationship works. It's how primary keys and foreign keys work. Now, if you get really excited about this and do some more delving into this, you can start looking at how primary key data gets generated. And the most common way to do that way back in the day was simply to have an auto-generated serial number. So this is in the field options, and you go and set up an auto-generated serial number. Now that can start any place you want because it really doesn't have any bearing on anything else in the record. And you simply set it to generate on creation, so every record that gets created gets the next serial number. The more common way of doing it these days, ever since FileMaker 12, when we got an actual function in FileMaker, is to have an auto-entered calculated value. And the function that we got given in FileMaker 12 was a function called getUUID, or get universally unique identifier. And that generates a universally unique identifier as a text string of hex code, whatever that is, if you simply put this calculation into that field option. In FileMaker 17, we've just got given a new UUID, and that is getUUID number. So that is a pure number. Some database people are saying, I prefer to use pure numbers than a string of text. It's more efficient in the database. Your mileage may vary on that one, depending on how big and complex your database is. And there have been custom functions around for many years that generate these sort of universally unique IDs as well. The thing that I would implore with you here is never use real data as your primary key, no matter how tempting that might be. You might say, well, we work in a hospital and all the patients are being given numbers from the hospital, so we'll just put the numbers into our database as their primary key. Or all these people in our database have social security numbers, so we'll put that in as the primary key. Or they've all got driver's license numbers, so we'll put that in. There are lots of reasons why you shouldn't ever use real data as a primary key. Sure, you can store it in the database, and sure, you can validate it as unique, but do not use it as the primary key. Generally, get your database to generate your own primary key. When you read around the subject, you might hear people talking about different types of keys. So we've talked about a primary key and a foreign key, but people also talk about candidate keys. And a candidate key is simply a field that could be used as the primary key. So you look at your data and you say, well, I could use that as a unique identifier, or that, or that. Those are candidate keys. When you choose one of those candidates, that's your primary key. The alternate keys are the ones that you don't choose as your primary key. So those are candidate keys that haven't got chosen as the primary key. Then you have compound keys, and compound keys are keys that are a combination of two or more fields that together make a unique combination. So when you look at something like latitude and longitude, latitude on its own is not a unique piece of data for points on the globe. Longitude on its own is not a unique piece of data. But when you put latitude and longitude together, that is completely unique for every point on the surface of the Earth. So that would be an example of a compound key. And then people talk about natural or domain keys, and that is the sort of thing like a social security number, which is supposed to be unique, but often isn't, and comes from the natural world and has something to do with the data. And finally, people talk about surrogate keys, and these are the sort of keys that I'm recommending that you use. They're generally generated by the database system, so they're auto-generated like an auto-generated serial number or an auto-generated UUID, and they have nothing to do with the data that you're putting into that record. So I generate a number for a person that's 1047, and the fact that it's Mary Smith or David Head doesn't really matter. It's got nothing to do with the data. So I only mention those because people say to me, well, yeah, you talked about primary and foreign, but I've heard about these other keys. Should I be using those as well? That sort of gives you a brief explanation of the definition. So when you go to create these keys in FileMaker, how do you generate the name for those? How do you name these keys? And then when I was preparing for this session, I got interested about what other people are using as naming conventions for these. So I asked a simple question on the FileMaker community: how do you name your key fields and why? And there were over 300 responses to that question, and some very passionate discussion and passionate opinions about how you should and shouldn't name primary keys and foreign keys. The upshot to all of that, to distill it all down for you, the best advice that came out of all of those posts were these sort of things. Please have a naming convention. Please have a convention for naming your keys and be consistent in applying that convention. Don't change your mind halfway through development. Keep it simple, which is a principle for a lot of things in life. And also be aware of any external system constraints. If your system is going to be exposed to external systems, as they often are these days, then be aware of what that external system might think of your naming convention. In FileMaker, you can do a lot of weird things. FileMaker is very forgiving as far as naming conventions go, but once you go outside the FileMaker ecosphere, then you have to sort of consider what the other systems are going to think about that. And just to distill it down again, in a simple example of person and note, this is sort of examples of what people came up with as possible naming conventions for primary keys on the left and foreign keys on the right. Personally, I would tend to pick something more towards the top of the list if you're naming as your naming convention. The ones down the bottom are put there as real examples of what people suggested, and they said, this is my naming convention. And some of those things are a bit extensive, some of them are a bit redundant in the way that they do it. I would prefer to pick something towards the top there. Now, a new feature in FileMaker 17 that we got given was default fields. So when you create a new table, you get given these 5 fields for free. And one of those fields is called primary key. Again, not a name that I would have chosen for the primary key, but you can change that if you want once the table is created. So you can make an ID of whatever you want it to be. And it's been set up for you automatically as a text field that auto-enters get UUID and is set with all of the auto-entry and validation options that should be set for a primary key. So that gets given to you for free. And this answers the question I've been asked in courses for years, and that is, if you think, David Head, that FileMaker or that primary keys are so important for every table, why doesn't FileMaker just give you one? And FileMaker 17 came out and I said, yeah, it does. So now you get one for free. So let's look at the simple one-to-many relationship here and have a look at where we set that up. And it's in the FileMaker relationship graph. We get to that through File Manage Database. And you should probably use the keyboard shortcut to get in, and when you do, you go to the relationships graph, and this is what you see. So you see boxes on that relationships graph. And this is pure FileMaker. This is how FileMaker manages relationships. And this is where people who are coming from another database platform have to understand the way that FileMaker does things. And it's a very unique sort of environment for the database world. So these boxes are, strictly speaking, called table occurrences because they represent a real table. There may be multiple table occurrences or multiple boxes per table. So if you had 2 tables in your database, you could have 10 table occurrences in your graph. And every table occurrence needs to have a unique name. So you can't have 2 table occurrences called person or 2 called note. If you hover over the little arrow above in the top left of a table occurrence, this pops up and it tells you the name of the source table, and it tells you where that table is, often in the current file, but it could be in a remote file somewhere on an SQL data source. And it also tells you, for interest, whether the file access protection is enabled. If you double click on the grey bar to open up the table occurrence, that's where you get the choice to be able to point to a different table with that table occurrence and give it a different name. So this is where you name these things. And when you put a new table occurrence onto your graph, you get the opportunity to say which table it represents and what you want to call it. So this is where we organise relationships in FileMaker. Creating a relationship really couldn't be simpler. It's a simple drag and drop process. So what we do is we get the primary key and we drag and drop it onto the foreign key. And we let go. Relationship done. Probably the easiest thing you ever do in a FileMaker database is to create a relationship between two tables. And as long as you drop onto the primary key onto the foreign key or the foreign key onto the primary key, it just creates that standard relationship. So if you want to edit that relationship, the options to do with that relationship, you double click that box in between on that relationship graph. And this opens up the relationship options. Up the top, it confirms what you've actually joined one to the other as being that relationship. And down the bottom, there are some options for setting either end of the relationship, which we'll look at in a moment. Now, at this point, I had a bit of a flashback when I was looking at my notes from relational design, and I realised that this was the edit relationship diagram back in 1996. Compared to the edit relationship in 2018. And there's a lot that's very similar. You're connecting one to the other. In the left-hand side, what you're doing is just click and then click on the right, whereas these days we can do more complex relationships, and there are even options down the bottom about cascading deletes and around creation of related records. So everything old is new again. Let's look more carefully or more closely at the graph symbols that you see in the relationship graph. Normally you would want to see represented there the one-to-many relationship that you intended to create. But understand that this is FileMaker's best guess as to what type of relationship you mean there. It looks at each of those fields, looks at the options set for those fields and says, oh, on the basis of what I see that field defined as, I reckon it's the primary key. So I'll make it the one end of the relationship. And on the other end, I don't see anything special about that, so I'll make it the many end of the relationship. If you don't get it right, if, for example, you forget to set up the primary key in the person table as an auto-entered serial number or an UUID, FileMaker will often represent this as a many. Now, that doesn't mean the relationship won't work, because at their heart, every relationship in FileMaker is a many-to-many relationship. It's only how you use it that changes. So in FileMaker 16 and before, if you used an auto-entered UUID, then it would represent the relationship like this. And you have to go into validation and turn validation on for unique, and FileMaker suddenly says, oh, I see, you're meaning that to be a primary key, I'll represent it as the one end. As I say, it doesn't make the relationship not work, it's just that it doesn't look right in your graph. These days in FileMaker 17, they made some changes for the add-on tables feature, and it meant that you don't even have to do that validation on. FileMaker will look at that and say, oh, you're using a UUID, therefore I think it's a primary key and it represents it correctly. Another graph symbol that you might see in your graph is a little bar on one end of your relationship. And what that means is that that field cannot be indexed. So typically in complex relationships, you might have a global field on one end of the relationship. And again, the relationship will work, but it's only unidirectional instead of bidirectional. And if you want to set up specifically a one-to-one relationship, again, you can force the issue and you can set up unique on both ends of the relationship, and FileMaker will go, yeah, I get what you're trying to do, that's a one-to-one. Now again, it's still a many-to-many relationship under the hood, but you're using it as a one-to-one. So just look out for those different graph symbols as you're building your graph. The box in the middle shows an equal sign for just a standard primary key to foreign key equijoin relationship. But with more complex relationships, you'll get an X in there or a greater than sign in there or some sort of weird symbols in there indicating complexity. So let's have a look at driving this relationship once we create it. If we look at how we display related data, the sort of aha moment that I had in my 1996 course, and we look at the person to note, a person can be related to many notes. So when we look at a person record, I need a way of displaying multiple notes. And we use an object called a portal, which we'll see in a moment. On the other end, the context from the other end is if we look at a note, there will only be ever one person attached to that note. So what we can do is put fields directly onto the layout. We don't need a portal. So let's look at how that works. Here we are on the one end of our relationship. We're looking at a person record in layout mode, and circled up in the status bar is the portal tool. So we simply select that portal tool and drag out a box like a rectangle, and the portal setup pops up, and we choose what related table we want to show records from, in this case note. And then we choose which fields out of that table we want to show in the portal, and those fields duly turn up in the first row of the portal in layout mode. And when we go back into browse mode, automatically we see all of the notes for that particular person. When we look at the portal, we need to look at how those records are sorted in that portal. And in this case, you can see the records are sorted in reverse order chronologically, and that would be a good thing. But by default, portal records are displayed in unsorted order. So these are the order of creation. By default, you will see related records in the order of creation. So for example, for notes, the last record created will be down the bottom of the portal. But we can change that. So there are two ways that we can sort a portal. One is by relationship sort order. We can go into the relationship. Remember the options down the bottom of the relationship dialog box when you click that, double-click that relationship. Down the bottom, you can sort the records in the relationship. So I can say, by default, notes should be represented in reverse chronological order. Or you can sort the portal. So again, double-clicking the portal in layout mode, opening up the portal setup dialog box, you've got a place there to sort portal records. If you specify both a sort order for the relationship and a sort order for the portal, which one wins? The portal. The portal. And that makes perfect sense. What it means is that we can set a default order for the relationship, and then whenever we create a portal, we can do whatever sort order we want, or we can just accept the default that's coming from the relationship. So that makes sense. So let's look at the other end, displaying data from the parent record. So this is from the one end of the relationship. So we're looking at a note here, and it would be useful to be able to see who this note belongs to. So in layout mode, we're simply going to go to the field picker, neatly pinned to the left of the screen in FileMaker 17, and we're going to choose a related table. We're on the notes table, and we're going to choose a related table here, which is the person table. And we're going to choose a couple of fields out of there, simply drag them onto the layout. And when we look at this in browse mode, we see that this note belongs to Matthew Johnson. Now, there is a little warning here if you do this, and that is initially those fields are fully writable. So typically what happens in this situation, someone's looking at a note and they say, oh, that's not a note for Matthew Johnson. That's a note for Jill West. I know, I'll just change it to Jill West. So you change Matthew to Jill and Johnson to West, and they go away blissfully happy that they've done the right thing. They've redirected a note to the right person, but what in fact they've done is they've changed Matthew Johnson's person record into Jill West. And when you hunt around the office to find out who did that, no one did it, because they didn't even know what they did. Someone says, yeah, I didn't do that. I changed one note, but I didn't change that. But they don't realise what they're doing. Easy fix to that, if you're going to display data in this way, In layout mode, simply uncheck the browse mode in the inspector. So it means that those fields will not be accessible in browse mode. It's useful to have them accessible in find mode, but don't have them accessible in browse mode on that end of the relationship. Force people to edit data in the correct context. So how do we go about creating related records? This is usually driven from the parent record. In the nature of our example, it would be unreasonable to create a note for a person unless the person already exists. So mostly when you're setting up user interfaces, you're saying create the person or find the person and then create a note about them, rather than the other way around. So the process is one of creating a new related record, populating the foreign key. So here's Matthew's personal record and his primary key. We go off and we create a new note, and that gets given its primary key automatically. And somehow we're going to get the foreign key filled in to attach that note to Matthew Johnson. And then we fill in the details about the note. So one way that you can do that is via a portal. And there is this phantom row that isn't really a record that you can just fill in and magically create a related record through the portal. And that's done by setting up again the relationship options here. So double click that equal sign in the middle and look at the relationship options, and in particular down the bottom there, allow creation of records in this table via this relationship. That will mean that when you get the portal, you'll have this blank portal row down the bottom that can magically create a related record for the record that you're on at the moment. Now that can work, all right, and the pros of doing that is that it's very easy to set up. It automatically creates the new related record and it populates it with the foreign key. You don't have to think about anything. The downside to that is that a portal provides limited access to data fields. If you've got a lot of data to fill in about that related record, a portal is not the place to do it. You could fill in sort of the key data about the note, but not all of the gory details. Users can be confused by this extra row down the bottom that they go, what's this for? I can't get rid of it. And the new record must be added at the bottom of the portal, which means that if you've got a portal that needs to be scrolled because you've got a lot of notes, they have to always scroll down the bottom to get to the new note and fill it in. So there are some downsides to this. So the way that I prefer to do it as a experienced developer is to simply give the user a button on the screen that says add a note. And that button will run a script such as this. Now, if you've never done scripting before, take it from me, it's not rocket surgery. It's not hard to understand what's going on in this. We're going to set a variable, we're going to remember the person that we're on, we're going to go to another place to create a note record. We're going to use setField to fill in the foreign key and link that new note to that person we were on, and then we're going to come back where we were and go to the last portal row and finish and let the person fill in the note. So it's a fairly simple script to create a user interface that basically they press the button and a new record appears at the bottom of the portal all ready to enter. So it's a very neat interface. Another way that you can do that, and sometimes my preferred way of doing this, is to do it via a new card window. Card windows, when they came into FileMaker, just another one of those things that changed my life. You can create a new card window and get the editing done in that. And that means that you abstract yourself from the limitations of a portal and you can have as many fields displayed there as you want for this new related record. So this is how that would work. Someone would press the add note and a card window pops up and you can fill that note in, and then you can click OK to cancel, OK, or you can click cancel. Now the advantage of this doing it with a script is that you've got the possibility of a very flexible user interface. You're not limited to editing data in a single row of a portal. There are lots of triggers that are available to say do this, do this, do this when the user does these things, and you've got total control of the whole process. If the user says cancel, you can say, right, I'm going to automatically delete that record without asking them. They said cancel the whole process, that's it, you're out of there. So you've got total control over that. The only downside to that is that you do need to have a little bit of scripting skill. But that's not hard to do, and there are probably sessions at DevCon here that can teach you at least as much as you need, or bail me up. Once we've got related data, we can use that in various ways. Apart from just displaying it on screen, we can use it in calculations. So we can do aggregate calculations. So for example, in a person's record, we could do a calculation which works out the total of all the sales that they've ever had with our company. We could work out the total of all of the amounts owing to our company from all of those sales. We could do a count of all the sales that they've ever had. We could do their average sale, the biggest sale, the smallest sale. So there are lots of calculations we can do by looking through a relationship at that related data. And we can also do direct calculations on the related records, often the first related record. So we can go through and say, right, on this invoice, I would like to simply calculate the customer's name and address and have it as one block on the invoice. So we can just go grab their name, their address, and put it all together in the block and display it on the invoice. So we can do those sort of calculations. The other thing we can do with related data is we can go way back to 1996 and we can do a lookup. There are still reasons why you need to do a lookup rather than a live relationship. So what you're doing with a lookup is you're effectively stamping a record with related data at a particular point in time. So common examples are things like the price for an item on an invoice. When I put an item onto an invoice, what it has to do is it has to go to my price list, my product table, and look up that product and find out what that product costs right now when I'm selling it. So say that product costs $100, it stamps $100 into that line item on the invoice. Because in 2 weeks' time, when the price goes up to $110, I don't want this invoice to change to $110. So we don't use a relationship, a direct relationship, to display that price field. What we do is we use a relationship to go and look up the price and stamp it into that record. I had a customer who used the current exchange rates for their sales. So they were selling things all over the world, and basically when you bought something off their site, they sold it to you at the current exchange rate that minute. That's how nice they were, I suppose. Often people say, oh, well, this year the exchange rate's about that, so this is what we're going to charge everyone when it goes up or down. But we found a way of web scraping a foreign exchange site every 5 minutes and getting all the exchange rates into the database. And when someone bought something, it went off and said, what's the exchange rate for US dollars as of right now, or in the last 5 minutes, and it stamped that into the sale record and said, that's the exchange rate you get. There are various techniques for doing this. There is still a field option available to do a looked up value, but generally we don't use lookups anymore. We use an auto-entered calculated value that replaces itself. So this can be a lookup. This can be forced to do a lookup. We can also do this through a scripted process to actually go and find that data and set field to put it into the appropriate place. So, have we had any moments? Any aha moments in here? Hopefully there have been some. We've covered here the concepts of relational design, what key fields are about, what key field data is about, how a one-to-many relationship works and how it's structured in FileMaker, and the sort of options you can set there, and then going through driving that relationship. So what you need to think about next is all the other types of relationships. So you can think about many-to-many relationships and how you resolve those. You can think about if you're ever going to use one-to-one relationships, and just between you and me, you should be. Also thinking about what we call utility relationships. These are relationships that don't necessarily have just a primary key to foreign key relation. What they allow you to do, for example, is to look at all the sales for a customer that haven't been paid yet, rather than just all the sales for a customer. So they're like filtered relationships. And also there's a lot out there about managing the relationship graph. Often you see very simple examples like I showed you where you have two table occurrences. But what about when you have 10 tables and 40 table occurrences and you're starting to join lots of things to lots of things? How do you manage that whole thing in the graph? So exciting times ahead. This session may have updates. I may change the PDF that's available on the website. And please remember to fill out your session evaluations. For now, thank you very much for attending this as your first session at DevCon 2018. And I wish you the best for the rest of your DevCon. If you see me around during DevCon and you've got some questions about relationships or indeed anything else to do with FileMaker, I'm very happy to have a chat with you and see what you want to actually set up. Thank you very much.